got a little bit of press and
I
so I think it was a mission to
I've never done. Yeah.
Are we good? Oh, looks like you're live.
There is speed.
All right.
Yeah, it's picking us. Yeah, it's picking everyone up. Yeah.
Good evening, folks. We're going to begin our program in just a minute or two, so if you'd like to find your seats, we'll get started in just a moment. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Andy Latcher, and I'm a member of the board and the chair of the Advocacy Committee at Cornerstones. I'm also a member of the Northern Virginia Hebrew Congregation, our host tonight. So, not a member of the Chamber of Commerce, but maybe they'll have me one of these days. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. It's a beautiful night, but you're all came inside to participate in a democratic process, and it's a very exciting that you're here for what I understand to be the 4th candidates forum for the 7th district of the Virginia House of Delegates. So thank you for all being here. Not all of you live in the House of District, in the 7th district, but you're interested in what's happening in the state. We have a full evening planned, starting with a welcome from Rabbi Michael Holtzman, who's the senior rabbi of the Northern Virginia Hebrew Congregation.
Thank you. Friends and candidates, welcome. I am honored to welcome you here to the Northern Virginia Hebrew Congregation. And I want to thank the Reston Chamber of Commerce and Cornerstones who organized everything, and thank Andy Latcher, who you just heard from, who's past president here and a member of just about every board under the sun, and the chair of the committee that hired me to be the rabbi here. So I'm really thankful still, Andy. In the weekday morning liturgy in Judaism, we have a special prayer asking God for binah, which loosely translates as discernment. That is what we are praying for tonight, the ability to discern, to differentiate, not just between the candidates, but more importantly, between our values. Public events like this are a chance to consider how we prioritize the huge and growing number of compelling issues facing our community, which means that at the same time that we pray for individual discernment, we are also praying for communal discernment that will emerge through the electoral process. Sometimes all of the various issues, the seriousness and complexity of it all can make us feel confused, despairing, or even cynical. So I would like to offer an additional prayer this evening, one of gratitude to every person present here, and to God for the miracle that brings us together. Because while this might seem like a rather normal, mundane event, something that is happening in thousands or even tens of thousands of other places around the country during this primary season, When we zoom out and we look at the big arc of human history, this is actually completely abnormal, amazing, and even, yes, miraculous. Think about what's happening here. We have a Chamber of Commerce, a body dedicated to a successful business environment, coming together with Cornerstones, a group working to lift up the most impoverished members of our community, gathering at a synagogue, an institution created to serve a tiny minority religious community, to talk with 4 different people who have stepped up to serve us as our elected officials, all of which is happening out in the open, in public, with the most important people in the room, all of us, the voters. The crazy mix of all of this, something we take for granted, business, social service, religion, and politics, all mixed together, is what we call democracy. And it is truly one of humanity's greatest achievements, one we should not take for granted. So tonight, I would like to offer this prayer and ask for your forgiveness, as I cannot stay for the entire evening. Atah chonen adam da'at melamed enosh bina. Eternal One, you grace humanity with knowledge, and you teach us how to find discernment. Grant that we can discern this evening through our listening, our understanding, and through the clarity of the voices before us, addressing some of the most important issues we face as a community. And modim anachnu lach, we are grateful before you, O God, for the privilege, the honor, and the pride to be here at this moment in our community, our commonwealth, our country, and the long arc of the human project, to accept our responsibilities and celebrate our opportunities as citizens in this miracle of democracy. We all say, Amen.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Charles Kapoor, President and CEO of the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber is honored to celebrate tonight and work with our longtime friends and community partners here at Cornerstones in offering tonight's program. Our thanks and appreciation to our 4 candidates who we will be hearing from tonight. Thank you as well to our panelists and our moderator for volunteering their time in attendance tonight. I'd also like to thank the following organizations that sponsor the Greater Reston Chamber's advocacy work throughout the year: Innova, Middlemasmar CPAs, Walsh, Colucci, Lubley and Walsh, Toth Financial, Dominion, Newmark, Transurban, and Sandy Spring Bank. Thank you to the folks at Crumble Cookies and Nothing But Cakes in Herndon for the refreshments that we will be enjoying tonight. And thank you to Jerry Ferguson and Fairfax Public Access for managing tonight's live stream. And finally, thank you to the team at the Northern Virginia Hebrew Congregation for their hospitality in hosting us this evening. The Reston community is on the cusp of a generational moment. For the first time in over 40 years, a new leader will represent our interests in the Virginia House of Delegates. We will hear from the 4 individuals seeking that responsibility so that each of us can make an informed decision at the ballot box. Our questions will explore the topics which impact all of us who live, work, or play in Reston. Our candidates will offer you insight on what they will do to address these issues in Richmond. Now, at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight's forum. Please welcome Tracy White, Vice President of Community and Government Relations for Reston Hospital Center and Vice Chair of the Cornerstones Board of Directors.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, as has already been said, for joining us here this evening on a beautiful evening to talk to our 4 candidates for the House of Delegates, District Number 7. They are vying for a seat during this primary. Primary day, if you haven't marked your calendars, is June the 20th. Early voting has already started. So tonight is going to give you some insight on our 4 candidates and some insight maybe on how your vote will be determined. So I would note that the invitations for tonight's discussion were extended to all of the registered candidates representing all political parties. This is a nonpartisan event, and neither Cornerstones nor the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce endorse any candidates running for office. Our candidates are, in the order in which they are seated, Paul Berry, Mary Barthelson, Keys Gamera, and Shamali Hubb. The seating order was selected by a random drawing for our planning committee and will be used to determine the order in which the candidates will speak. Each candidate will give an opening statement and respond to questions asked by our panel of community leaders. There will not be time for rebuttals this evening or for audience questions during the program. Candidates will have 3 minutes for an opening statement and 2 minutes each to respond to each question. A volunteer seated in the front row will hold up a yellow card for 15 seconds remaining in their time and a red card when time is up. Now I'd like to introduce our panel of community leaders who will be asking our questions tonight. We are joined by Mark Looney, a partner at Cooley, Stephen Smith Cobbs, pastor at Trinity Presbyterian Church, and Maria Olivares, a Reston resident and Laurel Learning Center parent. So thank you all for being here with us. All right, now we'll get started. We'll ask each candidate to share a 3-minute opening statement. The first opening statement will be from Paul.
Hey, good evening, everybody. The last time I was here was for bar mitzvah last month, so I understand the anxiety standing up here now. My name is Paul Berry, and I'm running for the House of Delegates. I am the son of a first-generation Mexican-American. My mother has been a public school teacher for nearly 30 years. I went to public schools my entire life and grew up on my father's farm, where I learned the value of hard work. Then I went to Brown University, where I studied mathematics. I'm a father and a husband. I'm an educator, a union member, and a medical volunteer. I have deep roots in this community. My wife and I first dated at Calypso's. We were married in front of the statue at Lake Anne. Our son was born here, and I teach in our schools. As an educator, I'm going to be prioritizing education issues in a time when Youngkin is attacking our public schools. I teach in our schools right now, and I understand student needs. It's more than just about performance. It's about their mental and social health and recovery. It's about teaching them that gun violence doesn't have to be the way of the future. It's about showing them to be good stewards of their environment. As a member of my teachers union, I believe and live every day with the values of fighting for working families. I'm even more motivated to run after seeing the equity gaps in our state in mental health, in education, in housing, in every area of our Commonwealth. More needs to be done. My strong advocacy for marginalized community is why Governor Ralph Northam appointed me to advise him on policy and budget issues. I was later elevated to a leadership position in the office of the governor because of the work that I was doing for Governor Northam. I worked with him, with his cabinet, with Democratic legislators to develop and craft policy and executive action that was turned from legislation into law. I'm ready to get to work immediately because I know the job. I know the legislative process, and I've been hands-on with it in Richmond for years. I'm going to be focused on kitchen table issues, fighting for better school funding, expanding mental health services, expanding children's health, fighting against and defending a woman's right to choose. These issues are on the ballot this year. If we don't take back the House of Delegates, and starting right here in the 7th District, I'm going to be fighting every single day for all of them. The values that we have in our delegate are going to be shown in Richmond every single day, and I look forward to earning your trust as Governor Northam trusted me, and I look forward to earning your vote. I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Mary Barthelson. I'm an engineer in the space industry and a community volunteer. I was born in Arlington and grew up in Fairfax City, where I went to Providence Elementary School before moving out to Haymarket, where I graduated from Battlefield High School's STEM and robotics program. I apologize for leaving the county, but my excuse is that I was a minor, so I was taken against my will. But as soon as I graduated, I moved right back to Fairfax to go to George Mason University, where I attended their bachelor's program and their master's program in systems engineering. And as soon as I graduated, I wanted to buy my first house in Reston because of the strong sense of community that we have here future. I have about a decade of experience in the space industry, as well as a few years in the security industry, working with technology such as biometrics, things like body cameras, etc. And I also have a lot of hands-on experience in the community, working with groups as a volunteer, such as Cornerstones, Reston Strong, and I've also participated in housing coalitions with the Fairfax NAACP. So really doing the hands-on work for our community, particularly for those who are the most vulnerable. Reston has 4 tent communities now, which are completely managed by volunteers. Many of those individuals have my personal cell phone number and I know their names. And I've been fighting for them for a few years now, advocating for solutions to housing insecurity and also the mental health challenges that come along with that. So I'm fighting to continue doing that advocacy for our community at the state level. And also because more than ever, we need people with a technology background holding office to make sure that legislation is keeping up with the changes of technology. We've seen a lot of chaos produced the last several years, really since 2016. More recently, bills not keeping up with the changes in technology and failing in the General Assembly because elected officials don't understand them. So they're getting confused over simple things like electric car standards and car emission standards. So how are they going to deal with the billion-dollar questions around things like nuclear energy, artificial intelligence? As a systems engineer, I am trained to work with people from different backgrounds with different skill sets to come up with ideal solutions to problems and to communicate those to people who are not technical. So if you care about the local issues and the big issues, then I'm your candidate and I hope to have your support.
Next is Karen Keys-Gamarra.
Good evening. I'm Karen Keys-Gamarra, and I am running to be your next delegate. I am the daughter of a military veteran and a social worker. I am the only girl among a family of 3 children, and I was literally taught, you are your brother's keeper. I took those values into our family when I married my husband, who was hiding in the back there, and we had our 3 children after we married in 3 children. And they all grew up in Fairfax County, attended Fairfax County public schools, have graduated, and one is a West Point graduate. I spent time at home with my boys because I wanted to make sure they had an opportunity to be successful. I volunteered to support women who were experiencing domestic violence. And when I engaged again in my professional life, I became a guardian ad litem. That is an attorney who represents the best interests of children to make sure they have a clear chance to be successful despite what they may be experiencing in their family. So I have practiced in family law. I have also been appointed as a planning commissioner, where I became intimately involved with land use issues. And in 2017, I was elected as an at-large school board member. Now, since that time, we've had some very interesting times in Fairfax. We went through this thing called the pandemic, and we had to reinvent education to some extent because we had a teacher shortage, because parents were afraid about their kids getting sick, and we needed to make sure that we continued to serve our community and provide education. So we used our buses to deliver food. We used all of our resources to make sure everybody had broadband, and we made sure that we used our schools as vaccination clinics. We did outreach both for mental health supports as well as making sure people felt comfortable coming back to school. And then we had this thing we call culture wars. We have dealt with banning books, changing Confederate names, etc., reviewing African-American history and deciding what part of history we actually wanted to talk about. In my experience as an elected official, I have been on the front lines fighting for our values. I stood up against book banning. I stood up against the comments that we can only talk about certain parts of raised my boys and explained to them, you were family. I don't care what you go through, that is your brother. That is how I feel about my neighbors. And so as I work to serve our community, I hope to have your support. Thank you.
Thank you. Next we have Shonda Howe.
Good evening. Thank you so much to the Chamber of Commerce and to Cornerstones for hosting this great forum. Thank you to the Northern Virginia Hebrew congregation for once again hosting such a wonderful event. And thanks to all of you for coming and spending your evening here listening to all of us talk. I'm Shonda Health, and I'm running for a House of Delegates in District 7. I'm an immigrant, an Air Force veteran, and a community organizer. And I'm a mother of 4. My youngest is transgender non-binary, so I know firsthand some of the attacks that have been coming from the far-right legislation in the General Assembly. I know how they impact our youth because several years ago, it impacted our family directly when we lived in a community that was unwelcoming to transgender children. Nick's attempted suicide. Fortunately, they survived, but they didn't know that they were facing depression and anxiety. They didn't know the mental health impacts of what was happening to them, and they didn't know to reach out. Over the last few years with the pandemic, we have seen a sharp rise in mental health needs across our community. It's so important that we address these from our children to people of working age, to our seniors, or so often who have been during the pandemic isolated. But that's not my only experience, that's my why. I have worked for years down in Richmond to get the Equal Rights Amendment across the finish line, to advocate for issues such as gun control and on the environment. I have advocated on things like public safety and transportation. I brought all of that to the local level, where right here in Reston, I have been working for the past 3 years until I left his office for Supervisor Walter Alcorn, who has endorsed my campaign, handling multimodal transportation, everything from walking to driving to transit, and public safety, from police to fire to first responders, as well as advising on housing, health and human services, and the environment, and the arts. So I have experience here at the local level working on nuts and bolts issues, like making sure that we get crosswalks where they need to be so our children can walk safely to school. Making sure our roads and facilities get paved. Making sure that policing happens in a positive and community policing environment. I've also worked at the state level, at the General Assembly, to get things across the finish line. I am here tonight because I am the candidate who has experience doing both. I would love to earn your vote tonight, and I look forward to your questions. My name is Shonda Howe, and I look forward to talking with you more later. Thank you.
All right, and now we will move on to the questions from our panelists. Our first panelist question comes from Mark Liddy.
Everybody hear me okay? So the metropolitan Washington area over the last several years has seen a net out migration of residents, meaning more people are leaving this region than moving to this region. The lack of affordable housing is a key component to that. Affordable housing is what is going to allow the region's employers to meet their workforce needs. Arlington recently changed its zoning ordinance to permit more dense residential development by right within that community. Over the last several years, there have been proposals in the General Assembly to override local zoning ordinances and permit more dense housing by right. And because Virginia is a Dillon rule state, the state has that authority. Would you support making a change at the state level to permit more dense by right housing in Reston?
Shambali, we're going to start with you.
So, first of all, I have a great deal of trust in our local government, having worked there. So I do think local governments who have their boots on the ground in each community have the feel for what is needed in each community in terms of housing and needs. That said, I think that we do need to take a look at how we can add more affordable housing. I know the county has already recommended an extra 10,000 units, and I know Supervisor Alcorn has laid down the gauntlet saying he would put 1,000 units into the 100 mil district and ask other supervisors to step up to the plate on that. And I am ready to work with our local boards of supervisors to make sure that what they need, the tools they need in hand, are there for them from Richmond. And I think that's the key. Sometimes passing something as a blanket across the whole state is not something that's workable in one community. That same rule could also be there to take away Arlington's right to do the type of housing that they feel is needed. So we do need to be very cautious in how we approach this and make sure that we're doing so with thoughtfulness and making sure that we listen to the constituents in the community, to our local supervisors and local leaders, and make sure that they have the tools they need, and I will be there to help that happen in Richmond.
Thank you. Karen? Thank you. Every person in our community has the right to expect to have access to housing. As a former planning commissioner, I understand the state has, at this point, set up laws where they delegate the rights of how you determine what happens in the local community to the board of supervisors, to local government. I actually think that is the right balance. I do not support, in a blanket fashion, to give that right away because you can't know in Richmond what is needed in a local community. The beauty about this is Reston is a wonderful community where Mr. Simon laid out principles of inclusiveness and diversity of housing. So the way that I would approach this is to encourage the state to adopt some of those same principles so that we would have diversity of housing across the state and Fairfax County in particular. For example, Reston has began with a variety of housing, whether it was apartment, multifamily, or single family. If you go to the rest of Fairfax, you would find that their comprehensive plan is based on single family homes with usually about a half acre. We need to change that and put some of those principles in place that Mr. Simon brought into, allowed us to build this community with here in Reston. And we can also provide incentives in a multi-pronged way to achieve that goal. And we also need to make sure that we are using our affordable housing fund and we are communicating with our community. I do never ever want to replace the voice of the local community with respect to how we develop our communities. And I actually think that Reston is already a leader in terms of how we provide housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary?
So as part of my volunteer work, I have advocated for certain zoning changes at the local level, particularly to allow for the use of commercial buildings as transitional housing for those who are unsheltered and living out in tents. It's hard to believe that with all these empty commercial buildings that we have people who are out there living in the woods. But unfortunately, that is the case. And I know that housing has been unaffordable for too many people. And Reston should remain a place where a couple who is looking to buy their first home and have a family can settle down, or someone who is looking to age in place can stay here. I don't think I would blanketly advocate for a zoning change at the state level because it's hard to know how it's going to be implemented, but we definitely do have a supply issue. We did get the county through our advocacy to agree to increase the housing available for those who are below the 60% AMI level, but we still need to come up with funding for those who are below the 30% AMI level. And we can also get creative on ways to get more supply on the market for housing that's already out there. That includes creating tax incentives to help redevelop homes which might be older and in need of repair and bring buyer. And, by creating those incentives, we can get some of those existing houses that are on the market out to buyers. And, I think I'd look at a multifaceted approach to addressing that.
Thank you. And Paul?
Thank you. So in January of 2020, I was elevated to a leadership position in the office of Governor Northam. This was just before the pandemic, and we all had these great plans about what we're going to be doing with the policy agenda, and COVID hits. I spent the majority of that year working on the eviction problem. And I think that's where I want to start with this answer, is that before we start talking about supply in the future, I want to keep people in their homes right now. Youngkin refused to extend the federal services and funding that would go towards the eviction problem, and evictions as a result have skyrocketed. So as delegate, the first thing I want to do is keep people in their homes. Next, let's talk about supply. The first thing we should be doing here in the 7th District and elsewhere is used paved services. There are so many paved over services that are unused parking lots right now in this area because of businesses that have gone full remote, businesses that have maybe not lasted over the pandemic. And before we start talking about developing on our green space, let's go with those spaces that are unused right now. Part of that might be converting commercial spaces into dwelling units, but the value has to be there for the developers. As a delegate, a public servant, I can't tell someone who owns property privately what they're going to do with that, but I would facilitate the incentives to make sure that happens. Some of those incentives are things like the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which for 2 years in a row, I advocated, and Governor Northam agreed with me, to increase the amount from $0 to more than $0. It was 85 million the first year, and I think it was 110 the second year. So with that relaxation of the affordable housing issue at the bottom, we can start to develop the medium and higher income units that are going to be available. That relaxation will hopefully, in an open market, create itself, because as a 6 to 8 week part-time legislator, I can't wave a wand and just overnight increase the supply. All we can do is work with developers, work with those that are going to increase the housing supply in order to do that.
Thank you all. Our next question is going to come from Maria Olivares.
The pandemic was hard on all students, particularly students of color, students with disabilities, and students experiencing poverty. Hunger or homelessness. Alarming number of students are reporting anxiety, depression, and thoughts of suicide. What specific bills or budget items need to be passed next session to ensure all our students are thriving?
And Karen, we're going to start with you.
Thank you. As a school board member who actually had to live through the pandemic, we did see more anxiety, more social anxiety in particular, and kids being afraid to come back to school. As a guardian ad litem, I've worked with a number of students that had such a degree of social anxiety that they get court involved because they have 60, 90 days of absences, and it requires a great deal of support. So one of the bills that I would bring forward is what I call, let's get serious about mental health. For far too long, providing mental health services or even accessing them for many communities engages or activates a stigma where people actually don't want to receive supports. And we have to have funding in our schools. FCPS is already providing social and emotional learning to try to help children be able to access their education. But we've also implemented telehealth to try to make sure students and their families have access to mental health provisions. Unfortunately, as a society, we do not look at mental health as a part of our overall well-being. And we have to take steps to make sure that we're educating people to understand that if we don't feel good about ourselves or we're suffering from anxiety, we really aren't well. And so I would put funding in all of these areas, in addition to providing tutoring for students who fell behind during the pandemic to make sure that they had the social and emotional learning as well as mental health supports and the tutoring they need to advance. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary?
Virginia has planned an additional $15 million for the 2024 budget to go to mental health services for students based out of our schools. So I would absolutely support that and make sure that we get it across the finish line and then that vision is actualized. I think it's also important to make sure that outside of school, students are getting the support that they need. Nearly half of the children in Virginia are on Medicaid, so it's important to make sure that that is fully funded. And something that I've advocated for the last several years is bringing a mobile mental health crisis unit to Reston. This is a service which is available to other parts of the county. It's the emergency unit that deploys with police to give people psychiatric evaluations. Unfortunately, that's not a service that's available to us in our corner of the county, and as a result, we have had people killed by police who are not trained to deal with mental health crisis. So the first thing that I'm going to do is make sure that we get a unit based out of our corner of the county, and so that service is available to everyone. I would also look at how we can get more social workers. Right now, Virginia is the second strictest state in terms of becoming a social worker. And we have people who have moved here from Maryland who are qualified to work, but unfortunately they can't because of our laws. So I would make sure that we have reciprocity with other states in order to get more social workers on the market to support our kids and everyone else in our community as well.
Thank you. And Paul?
So schools to me are anchors in the community. They're environments where the whole community comes together, and we should be treating it as a holistic experience. My work with Governor Northam focused primarily on the Latino community, so I'm going to be talking about that experience primarily. Latinos in the Commonwealth have the lowest high school graduation rates, they have the lowest college admission rates, they have the lowest children's health insurance rates. This was all before the pandemic. And my point is that with these holistic environments where students are already facing challenges, we need to be thinking about wraparound services and the entire student experience when they step in out of their home and go to school and come back. Parents need to be supported, teachers need to be supported, and the students themselves need to have the support. That means lifting the cap on support services to lower the ratio of school counselors, psychologists. We need to lower the administrative duties that teachers and counselors have on their plate so that they can focus on the students themselves. The schools that we construct should be built with the community environment in mind, and we should be bringing that infrastructure into the 21st century. In terms of the mental health services that we can partner with in Fairfax County, there are a number of tremendous non-governmental organizations like El Futuro that Fairfax County itself gives money to in partnership to bring students back, identify the needs in the community, and then bring those needs to the school so that they can begin to solve the problems. I think as a legislator in Richmond, we should be seeking out those organizations that are in the communities themselves so that each community can identify and work on its own blueprint. No one single solution out of Richmond is ever going to solve everything, so I see the solution here to be more of a facilitator role, and I'm eager to form those connections the same way that I did in the office of Governor Northam.
Thank you. And Shamali?
So this is something that I really have some intimate knowledge of. And I think it starts with a couple of different things. You asked what legislation we would pass. This last session, there was legislation that was introduced that simply would have taught our children what different mental health illnesses are and how they could possibly approach treating them. That failed in this legislature. I would definitely make sure that things like that got across the finish line, that we made sure that our children know, because when Nix went through this, they didn't know they had depression. They didn't know what the symptoms were, and I as a parent did not know that either. And so I didn't have the tools in my hand to identify that my child needed some extra assistance. So that's, that is one step, and that is the basic level. But beyond that, we need to look at what we're doing here. The CDC report said that 60% of girls have depression and anxiety. That's huge, 60%. And that was only in the gender binary. So that didn't even look at our trans and non-binary students or gender fluid students. So, this problem is even vaster than what we recognize from the CDC. So So besides having just early training, one of the things that I've done is I've reached out and talked to area counselors, regional mental health professionals to look at what we need. And in schools, instead of just going with child psychologists and child specialists, what we need are family counselors, because any trauma that happens in the school is also trauma informed from home or has a repercussion in the home, right? So having somebody there who can address the entire family situation is something that would be very helpful to students to make sure that they are taken care of in every capacity. So that's a second piece of legislation. But we also need to take a look at what some of the other mental health needs are overall. We always end up at beds, but before we get beds.
Thank you,
we
Shanley.
need
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, our next question is from Stephen Smith Cobb.
Many COVID-era federal grants and protections are ending, including rental assistance, enhanced child care subsidies, and supplemental staff benefits. Regardless of the official end of the pandemic, though, we know that recovery for many families is ongoing. It will take many years. Families now are facing double-digit rate increases and the effects of inflation on their household budgets. Question is, how should the Commonwealth respond to meet Virginians' most basic needs and aid in their recovery?
And Mary, we're starting with you.
So I think that we're definitely seeing the effects of the pandemic at the tents. We have people who are homeless for the first time living out there because there's not enough housing and not enough shelters available for them, but many of them actually have jobs and they work in the area, but they can't afford to live here anymore. So I think the biggest thing is, addressing the challenges that our essential workers are facing with not making enough money to be able to live here, making sure that we're fully funding housing programs and also workforce development programs, and also working with our small businesses to see what we can do to support them. We do have a labor shortage right now, and as I mentioned, we also have people who are qualified to work who can't because there's state laws in the way. So we need to see how we can remove workforce barriers and improve reciprocity with other states so that we can get people who are trained into professions and are able to use it. There's no reason to have a labor shortage when you have people who want to work and have qualifications. And when you work, you should be able to live where you work and not deal with homelessness. So, I would just continue doing the work that I'm already doing for our community.
Thank you, Paul.
So the question was focusing on the how here, and this one's pretty easy. Governor Youngkin keeps talking about a $2 billion surplus of money that he wants to give, and I'm not making this up, corporate tax breaks that the corporations don't want themselves. That $2 billion represents taxpayer money that has been underfunding mental health services, housing services, education, health services, you name it, since the global pandemic of 2008. Now, I get in 2008 that we had to tighten the belt and the budget had to be trimmed so that we could achieve everything we wanted to achieve with less resources, fewer resources. But now, almost a decade and a half later, that $2 billion represents a bunch of different policy priorities that we need to start prioritizing if we want to achieve our values in our budget. So the rental assistance program, I talked earlier about the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. I think that $2 billion should be devoted to that. Food security in our communities through partnerships with organizations like Cornerstones and others, like Futuro, like I mentioned earlier, that reach out to vulnerable communities directly. Those partnerships should be increased. We can talk about other things like English language learner funding. In Fairfax County Public Schools, $1 million of federal funds has disappeared from ELL funding last year, and there are no plans to replace it. Everything that we can achieve, we can do it together. We can do it as a community. We can do it through partnerships with organizations that already exist. And the best part of it is that we don't need to raise taxes. The money is there. but we have to stand up to this governor and refuse to let him give tax breaks to corporations, again, that don't want the tax breaks. So as delegate, my first vote would be against any budget that refuses to fund our progressive values and ensure that those who are most vulnerable in our community are achieving everything that they want in their lives and getting everything that they need.
Thank you. Shanley?
So I think it starts with, let's feed people. Let's make sure that they're housed. Let's make sure that they feel safe. I mean, these are things that are basics. And I think when we do that, we build community. You know, over the pandemic, the federal government stepped in, our county government stepped in, and gave a lot of resources to our community. It allowed everyone the grace to be able to stay in place, stay safe, and to thrive. And our economy has recovered a great deal because of that. We are still in that recovery process. We're not done. The pandemic is not really over. There are still repercussions from this, and some long-term repercussions. And I think the state needs to step up and make sure that we do those things. Feed people. Let's spend the money to feed, make sure people have food. Free lunches, free breakfast for our children, making sure that they don't go hungry is important. Making sure that people stay in their housing and have housing access is important. Shelter. And finally, making sure that they have security and safety. And that doesn't just mean safety from public things like, you know, gun safety, because frankly, the anxiety from that is awful. And we need to address that. Safety also includes security in jobs. And so I think economic security is also a component of that we can work on in developing economic security across the state. One of the things that I think needs to happen is we need to lift up other regions to build their tax bases. Make sure that they have what they need so that they can then send more tax money to Richmond and allow us to grow. So.
Thank you. And Karen?
We are all neighbors, and we all should expect to be able to have a place to live and have food. So I think it's time for the state to recognize that we need our own recovery program. We need our own statute that recognizes that while federal funds have ended, our neighbors have not fully recovered. And we should have focuses like paying for school lunches and providing breakfast. There's a stigma for our students who feel as though I don't have lunch money today. And if you go in some of our schools, you will see that there are huge bills that parents are trying to pay. We need to remove that problem. We also need to recognize that there are families that are struggling who have lost SNAP benefits or trying to make ends meet. And so while we need to recognize these things, we also need to recognize that we actually need to count appropriately. We had a shortfall in figuring out what was necessary for our schools to the tune of about 200 million. And now we're talking about a surplus. Absolutely focus on establishing our own recovery plan to make sure that we address food, we address things needed in our schools, including mental health, that a component of that would be avoiding and trying to make sure we're not increasing in eviction rates and making sure that our kids have access to what they need and our families. We are in a mental health crisis, not just as schools, but as a nation, and we need to have access to thriving economies in every corner of our state. And that means we also give incentives for small businesses to begin the process of making sure we have availability of training for new jobs and clean jobs. I have to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Our next question comes from Mark Looney.
Virginia is what is referred to oftentimes as a right-to-work state. In a right-to-work state, union membership cannot be a condition of employment, and employees are not obligated to pay dues into unions. Do you support Virginia maintaining its right-to-work laws? And if not, what changes would you make?
And Paul, we're starting with you.
I absolutely absolutely love this question. So no, I do not continue to support Virginia's right to work, and I hate the term right to work. This was invented to purposefully confuse people. Right to work means employers are protected, not workers. Working families don't have benefits and economic security. It means that those who are seeking employment can be at will fired for whatever reason the employer determines. That is not a set of values that I think we should be holding for anyone. I think I myself am a member of my teachers union. Before this, I was a member of UAW. Before that, I was a member of AFSCME. I have been part of unions for almost a decade. And this has been one of the greatest joys that I get to work to repeal right to work in a variety of different states all over the nation. I actually recommended to Governor Northam in 2020 during the pandemic that he should eliminate, when we still have the Democratic trifecta, right to work. And we've seen in states like Michigan that just did that the economic success can still be there. Virginia ranked as one of the poorest states for workers up until the Democratic trifecta a few years ago. And when I was fighting for things like wage theft investigators to ensure that subcontractors weren't illegally or underfunding their payments to workers, and other issues that were important to the working families of Virginia, I was hoping that Governor Northam, and I still hold out hope, that we're going to get rid of right to work one of these years. Virginia has made some great progress in terms of becoming a better, more friendly state for workers, but we still have a long ways to go. And I would absolutely vote in a heartbeat for any bill or co-sponsor a bill that would eliminate right to work from our state.
Thank you, Shamali.
So I will echo that. I think right to work is a misnomer, and it's a disservice to our workers and our community. It harms all of us. And I would strongly support repealing right to work. I think we are strong when we have working families that can afford to live and thrive in our communities. And when that happens, they have more expendable income, and that reverberates throughout the community. You know, I was talking to people, often cite small business owners as being, having difficulty with right to work, unionizing, or a $15 minimum wage. You know, I talked to several small business owners, and they actually said, you know what? A $15 minimum wage means more money comes in the door here. Because when we have people who are paid well in our communities, they can come to our store. They can spend money and do the things around that supports our business. So I think repealing right to work actually creates a thriving economy, and I strongly support repealing it and making sure people have the right to collective bargaining, because you know what? People deserve having things like affordable health care, paid sick leave, paid medical leave. We found out during the pandemic how important some of this was. Do we really want people who are sick coming into work because they don't have the leave? No, we don't. We would like them to do what they need to take care of themselves. And frankly, when we have unions advocating for these things, our workforce is well served, as are we.
Thank you, Karen. I do support the repeal of right to work. And it's because history tells us that when we have unions, we actually support workers. We are in a national worker shortage. Virginia has been having difficulty getting necessary workers all over the state. One of the ways that we can attract workers is to make sure we have the best working conditions available. When we have unions in place, as we voted for Fairfax County past collective bargaining this past year, we provide a place at the table for people to discuss those things that impact them every day. It feels more fair. It results in better wages. And we have families that feel supported. We absolutely need to make sure that our families understand that union wages are available and they can have not just $15 an hour, but a living wage. We started talking about $15 an hour several years ago, and this needs to be linked
to inflation. Because people need to understand that when they come to Virginia, they are going to be treated well. They will be living in a thriving community and a thriving economy, and their families will be well supported. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mary?
Right to work severely limits unions' abilities to fight for the best interests of workers in terms of wages, also retirement, sick leave, and also working conditions. And a lot of people who defend it like to point out that Virginia is the #1 state to do business, but what they fail to mention is that Washington State is the #2 state to do business, and they don't have right to work laws. So I will absolutely support repealing right to work and supporting collective bargaining.
Thank you. Our next question is from Stephen Smith Cobbs.
You are all running to be members of the General Assembly. This is a question about the role of the General Assembly. What is the General Assembly's role in promoting fair housing practices and implementing rental control measures, considering the significant need in our region for affordable, quality housing, and a responsibility to protect the interests of local businesses, including landlords?
And our first question goes to Shamali.
Thanks. Yeah, I lost track of that. Thank you so much. So what is the role of the General Assembly in affordable housing and rent control? Of course, we could pass legislation. And we could pass legislation that blankets the whole state with a particular policy. But again, is that the best thing to do when we have needs that are vast and different across the Commonwealth of Virginia? I'm not sure that that's the case. I absolutely think that we should have a policy that's passed that allows localities more flexibility in doing the things that are needed in certain areas. So, allowing localities more flexibility is, I think, the best way to make sure that we're doing the things that are appropriate for each region. What is good for us here may not be really good for Southwest Virginia or Southside Danville. We need to make sure that we have the policies across Virginia are flexible enough to allow our localities and our jurisdictions to make the decisions that are needed. We talk about making sure that people don't get evicted, and I think eviction rules are something that's appropriate for us to address, because we know that once somebody's out of housing, it's much harder to get them back into housing. So if we could prevent them from being evicted in the first place, that would be something worth doing across the Commonwealth, because I think that's something where we can have, a greater impact across the region. We found out during the pandemic, as people's utilities were cut off and they couldn't pay for utilities, that often that led to an eviction, and we were able to stop a lot of that during the pandemic and put it on hold. We need to do more of that.
Thank you. Karen?
Can I ask you to repeat the question? I missed part of it in my notes. I'm sorry.
What is the General Assembly's role in promoting fair housing practices and implementing rental control measures, considering the significant need in our region for affordable, quality housing and a responsibility to protect the interests of local businesses, including landlords?
So the role of the General Assembly is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of its residents, and to make sure we have a thriving economy for everyone to benefit those communities. I would absolutely support a full study to determine the best ways to do that. I am not opposed to looking at ways to supplement rent. However, as a family that my family had rental property, I understand you have to be able to pay the mortgage. So we do have to look at what that balance is. The fact of the matter is, housing is a fundamental right in the sense that people do not feel safe without having housing. So we do need to look look at a multi-pronged approach as to how we provide affordable housing, how we can make sure we're using the trust fund, how we can use, even perhaps there's an idea to use the taxes off of escrow to add to that fund trust, and to make sure that we're providing a diversity of housing. But I absolutely believe that we first need to establish the policy that housing is something that everyone needs, and that we need to explore various ways to make sure that we can provide that, and with a menu of diversity of housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary?
I think that the General Assembly has a role to play in making sure that every individual is treated fairly, and that includes both renters and landlords. And they also have a role to play in making sure that there is enough supply on the market to meet the needs of the public. And unfortunately, we do have a supply issue, which has contributed to an increase in rent. I do own a home, and I am a small landlord. I have roommates that rent for me, and we dealt with the challenges through the pandemic of them not working, me still needing to pay the mortgage. And I think that it's important to look at both sides, but we should absolutely make sure that there's nothing discriminatory taking place and that the eviction process is fair. And as I mentioned, we are still in need of finding funding for those who are below the 30% AMI level. There is a plan to increase housing available to those below the 60% AMI level. And there's additional programs that can be supported for those who cannot afford to pay rent in the area. So it's important to fund those. And there's also creative solutions to helping increase that supply. And if you can increase the supply, then the prices should go down a little bit. So that includes, as I've mentioned before, looking at tax incentives for getting older homes on the market, as well as looking at how we can create, maybe raise the capital gains tax. And, I'd like to study that a little bit more carefully before proposing something specific. But I think that tax incentives and funding programs to increase the supply is really the way to go.
Thank you. And Paul?
So in the Code of Virginia, my role is defined in statute as the formal bridge between the office of the governor and the community. And as delegate, that's what I want to continue doing in the General Assembly. I want to be a leader that connects Richmond solution-based ideas to the local solutions that are led right here in the district. That collaboration can take a number of different ways that we can do today. We don't need to study it anymore. These are the things that I proposed to Governor Northam before and during the pandemic. Implementing the American rule. The American rule during eviction proceedings ensures that both the litigant and the person in the eviction proceedings pay their own attorney's fees. Right now, sometimes it's the case where people who are being evicted have to pay the legal fees for the person that's trying to evict them. That incentivizes landlords to jump right into the eviction process without any consideration about the costs involved. Protecting and expanding the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, as I've mentioned many times, offering language services to anybody that needs them during eviction proceedings. And this one absolutely is my favorite, right to counsel during first hearing. Most people, it's something like 80%, go into an eviction proceeding, they're the ones being evicted, not understanding that they could consult with a counsel before they stepped into the chamber. That immediately sets them on a spiraling track that normally leads to eviction. Lastly, I think that, and this one is a smaller, but I think an effective measure, currently for public housing under state law, if you get an eviction notice, it's required that the person posting, like putting the letter on the door, accompany that letter with a flyer that offers information for local eviction proceeding services, organizations that will help them. We should institute that across the board. If you're going to evict someone, at least do them the courtesy, the decency of offering to help them find services that can help them stay in their homes.
Thank you, Paul. Our next question comes from Mark Looney.
collectively, the federal, state, and local governments, along with the private sector, invested $6.5 billion in the Silver Line. And the second phase just opened a little over 6 months ago. But beginning in July of 2024, Metro is facing a nearly $750 million deficit in its operating budget. What strategies would you advocate that the Commonwealth of Virginia take to assist in closing that gap?
And Karen, we're starting with you.
So Metro is a great idea, and everybody needs transportation. Part of the problem is that it travels east and west, and people don't exactly live along that line. So we have to find ways to make sure that it's actually accessible and it helps helps to support local business. My idea to try to make sure that we can fund that deficit is to make sure that we're looking at transportation overall. For example, we need to tie our travel not just to the metro, not just along the metro, but throughout the region, to to small businesses, to other areas where they don't have service, have it connected to our buses, etc. We need to highlight small businesses everywhere. And we may have to have a tax or something of that nature to try to make sure we take care of that deficit. It would be a shame to lose the metro. I certainly would want to do everything that I can, but I also am very concerned about pushing something on our community that they don't want. I do understand that there was a proposal earlier where a delegate proposed that there be a gambling establishment. That is something that needs to be discussed locally, and that the state should not have an override. So I'd like to have a number of ways to raise revenue, but overall, we need to respect the local government and make sure that the people's will in those areas has not been overridden. Thank you.
Thank you. Mary?
Unfortunately, there is frequently issues with properly funding the metro and, all of the buses that go to the metro so that people can access it. So I would definitely make sure that we properly fund them and remove the 3% cap on growth and contributions. I'd also like to improve safety measures for our transit workers and, make it more available to those who are low income. I know that parking prices can be exclusionary for some if they don't live near a bus line. The county has reduced the number of bus routes that are available to the public. So that is something that would also hurt metro use for those who don't live nearby and can't afford the parking. So it's really a matter of being willing to fund it and champion that, and I absolutely will.
Thank you. Paul?
So I'm a mathematician by academic and professional background. I teach 9th and 10th grade math, mostly at Vernon High School. I love solving problems. I love the numbers. This question was about how we're going to do it again. I'm going to go back to a previous answer. We have this $2 billion surplus. We have surplus, air quotes, for surplus every single year. Part of that has to be devoted to transportation, not just in Fairfax County, but it should be devoted partially to transportation. Fairfax is an economic engine for the Commonwealth. I know that there are other centers that have their own, like Norfolk, Newport News, Richmond, but we generate more tax revenue than we send to Richmond, and we get back less. So if we're going to be paying for the metro and generating an economic success story that's taken decades to build, then Richmond needs to recognize that and start devoting some of the resources, for example, in the surplus, that can go back into the metro system. That is I think it's a key ingredient of that success story. I will take the trouble to mention that when the last phase was opening of the Silver Line, that the union-made parts of the Silver Line, those were the ones that didn't have to be rebuilt. So again, I think the money is there. We don't need to raise taxes on anybody. I'm against that. That's a knee-jerk reaction that I don't think we need to explore. The surplus is available, and we should start taken a look at it with our progressive lens and seen where our priorities lie. What do we value here? We'll have to make hard choices, but at the end of the day, money doesn't grow on trees. And as delegate, I want to work together with Governor Youngkin because at least I recognize that he's our governor. I may not like it very much, but I still want to collaborate with him in good faith. And that means we have to pass budgets with his help. And I look forward to doing that, but I also want to make sure that we're not compromising on any of our values in order to do that.
Thank you. Shamali.
So metro funding is a very complicated entity because we have several jurisdictions, Maryland, DC, and Virginia, that are all paying into it. It is not an easy answer, and frankly, it's not something that can be addressed quickly in the way that it is currently structured. I do think that we need to look at restructuring how Metro is funded and look at maybe a dedicated funding source that is continuous, because that's what something like Metro needs to be able to operate from year to year, instead of depending on each jurisdiction to pass legislation in order to fund the components that are going into that area for that time. It's something that we need to look at because, as has been pointed out, Metro brings economic development to this area. Taking it out to Dulles and then out into Ashburn is a boom. We are seeing ridership slowly go up, and yes, we have an east-west Metro. We have a north-south. It's not in our jurisdiction. But what we need to do is expand some of our bus routes to help support that, because working in transportation and also working on the environment, I know that we need to move to a more transit-oriented society where we get out of our vehicle and use our transportation network as much as possible. But, you know, there are a lot of great programs out there. There's actually a program for seniors and people with disabilities. It's a federally funded program that helps teach you how to ride the Metro and access bus well. So if you need special services, you can get that. You learn how to make sure you're using the machines properly without leaving it open so that your card can be swiped. You know, somebody else can come right behind you and add $20 and it's only on your card to do these basic services. And I think the more we use our public transportation system, the better it works.
Thank you, Shamali. All right, our next question comes from Maria.
Tell us about how you work now as a community leader and what you will bring to Richmond as your leadership style.
All right, and Mary, we're starting with you.
As I've mentioned, I am the grassroots candidate in the race, in addition to being an engineer, and I'm very hands-on in the community. If you think about the services that the government offers, there's always a gap. So anything that is not addressed, that's where I spend most of my time doing that work. And it has really illuminated a lot of the challenges that we are experiencing. It's easy to read something on the news or in a report, and it's different when you're actually hands-on and see it face-to-face. So we've heard questions about funding certain programs, and I've actually worked hands-on with a lot of those programs. And I know that sometimes the issue isn't funding, sometimes the issue is having staff there available to be able to support that program. And I have a lot of those relationships with our local community advocates who are providing the hands-on services. So I would continue doing that work for them and making sure that we're coming up with creative solutions to problems and not simply calling them, giving them a check and having them walk out the door and expecting them to solve everything themselves. I also would like to see more hands-on collaboration between our elected officials and subject matter experts. Right now, I think that they vote on complex bills regarding technology that they don't fully understand, and those can be very costly decisions. And often it's the taxpayers that shoulder that burden, unfortunately. But if we have someone there who can advocate for our best interests, then we can get the proper policies passed in a timely fashion election. And that's going to be my focus.
Thank you. Paul?
During the pandemic, so I'm a member of the Medical Reserve Corps. During the pandemic, I was deployed all over Fairfax County. So in terms of being a community leader, I was a community collaborator in the sense of trying to improve the public's health when we were all suffering the worst global pandemic in a century. I continue to do that work now, which is a great delight. Now, instead of vaccination clinics, we're doing hearing and vision testing, or flu clinics for students who are getting their first vaccinations before they go to kindergarten. Chairman Jeff McKay asked me to lead the decennial redistricting process. It's one of the most incredible opportunities I've had in my public service work. A mathematician getting to work with numbers and maths that will shape the next 10 years of the county was just a great experience for me. After that, Chairman McKay asked me to stay on and use the committee that he had formed and I was leading the process to remove the names of slaveholders from our magisterial districts. That too was a very rewarding experience, and I'm glad that I was able to take part in it. I'm an educator and I'm a data scientist, so being in the classroom is always an opportunity to lead and to learn how to lead. Students are the most incredible inspiration to me every single day, and it's a great, again, opportunity to learn how to lead. My leadership style in Richmond, I want it to be partnership-based. I want to have an open door policy. I want to have an open communication policy. If anybody ever wants to get in touch with me, all you have to do is go to my website and my phone number is there. I can't do this job alone in Richmond, certainly not in 6 or 8 weeks. And as delegate, I will insist that members of the community partner and collaborate with me to form solutions. No one person can do it alone, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to work with anybody that wants to make our community better.
Thank you. Shamali?
So how will I lead in Richmond? I will lead the way I've led my entire life, with integrity, kindness, and service before self. It's the basic tenets of how I've lived my life and what I've done. Servant leadership is what is expected by our community, and that is what I intend to have. I'm a grassroots organizer. When we moved here to Reston, shortly after that, we had some elections that were maybe not what all of us wanted. I formed a grassroots group, and there was me and 75 of my best friends met in our little town hall every 2 weeks. Some of you are in this audience. Met in my home every 2 weeks to try to figure out how we could make things better. We called ourselves here Our Voice Reston. I will be Reston's voice in Richmond. That's what I promise to you. I love to go out and talk to people in the community and find out what is on your mind, what are the issues that are important to you, and make sure that we get some of that work done. I've been doing constituent services for the past 3 years for Supervisor Alcorn. We take calls every day, all day long, from members of our community with needs that need to be met. And I think that when we go to Richmond, it's not just our time at the General Assembly and passing some legislation. It is always about making our community better. So I promise I will lead with integrity, with kindness, and with service.
Thank you. And Karen?
Leadership is just another way of saying that you're willing to be a public servant. As I have grown up in my community, it was a way of life. I worked on voter protection prior to some of the elections that were referred to. I worked inside of the polling places to make sure that people felt that they actually had access. My primary style is to make sure I listen and that I do the best that I can to be effective and to collaborate as I have done on the school board. One of my proudest moments was to recommend the John Lewis Leadership Academy. Now, I happened to do it in the middle of COVID, so some people got a little nervous. we have a $3.5 billion organization, and we always have to be about the business of improving. And so I did the hard work. I had opportunities to speak to people in the community. As soon as they heard me say, this is what I want to do when we change the name of this school, there is no way you can take the name of an icon like John Lewis and not have it mean something in the school. And where do we need to develop our leaders? But in our schools. And so I made that proposal, and I worked with the bipartisan project program. I always get their name mixed up. But it was all about talking to people with different ideologies and bringing them together. By the end, we had developed a committee of 70 leaders, not just from our region, but from across the nation, one of whom is in charge of John Lewis's foundation. And we made a recommendation with deep research, recommendations from that entire committee, and the school board voted unanimously that we would prepare the leaders of the future. That's the kind of leader I will be in Richmond. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. All right, our last question is a lightning round question. For the candidates, you each have only 60 seconds to answer the question. And the question is, if you could choose just one bill, you only get one to introduce in your first session, what would that bill be? And Paul, we're going to start with you.
So I would propose a firearms buyback program. It would be a non-mandatory program that would be optional in jurisdictions. Why is it optional, you say? Well, because we have a Republican governor, and I would want to sign it into law. But there are also jurisdictions, frankly, that wouldn't support it in one or even both chambers. And I want to be realistic as a legislator with the piece of legislation that I'm proposing. I can't tell you how many times that I heard during the Democratic trifecta, Paul, we're all Democrats, you know, we're going to look into this, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes it's hard to even work with your own team. And as we saw in the Senate, unfortunately, the assault weapons ban failed. I don't want to see my bill fail on a firearms buyback program that would allow localities to take weapons out of the community and ensure that they're not a danger to the people who own them or to others who would have access to them.
Thank you. Shamlin?
So we only get one, and I have already announced this, but I plan to get rid of the disability waiver wait list. There are Virginians who've been waiting on this list with their family members for years, absolute years, because we have this long list. I ran into a family just last week whose child came off of it at age 17, who was on since age 5. That is unbelievable. This is a debt that we owe our constituents. It would help Virginians across the Commonwealth, and frankly, it's one that we can pass because you know what? Disability does not have a political party. So, you know, we should be able to get buy-in across the entire Commonwealth to make sure we take care of our most vulnerable folks, because that's what we are about as Democrats.
Thank you. Karen?
I have to ban assault weapons. I have been knocking on doors, I have been talking to students, and our community members are afraid. They are reading newspapers, virtually every day, we are seeing another incident. And then we hear something about thoughts and prayers and thoughts. Here's a thought, let's actually do something. Let's actually admit that part of our kids that are experiencing mental health problems is because we haven't protected them. I knocked on the door the other day. I had to walk away because we were both getting emotional. It was an FCPS teacher, and she was one of those people who has to prepare our kids for those lockdowns and get them ready for a potential shooter. And she welled up in her tears. And I understood her pain. We can't keep talking about it. We have to do something.
Thank you. And Mary?
The first bill I'd like to pass is a study opportunity to examine and compare barriers to entry into Virginia's workforce compared to other states for essential industries such as social work. I know that we are the second strictest state in the whole country in that field, and that we do have people who are unable to work, who are trained, as well as having a need for it, and that's really unfortunate. It's great to talk about all of these services that we're going to fund, but I know that some of them have closed because we don't have the workforce to be able to address that. And there's really no reason for that, and it's hard to get anything done if you don't have the people in the right positions.
Thank you, Mary. All right, so that finishes our questions for this evening. I would like you all to join me in thanking the participants for being here. It is not for the faint of heart to be running for office, and it is not for the faint of heart to serve. Virginia does have a part-time legislature, but it really is a full-time job. They are down in Richmond continuously. They are working with constituents continuously, and we are grateful for our 4 candidates here and their willingness to serve in this district. It is now my pleasure to introduce Carrie Wilson, who probably needs no introduction, but still, Carrie Wilson, the CEO of Cornerstones.
Thank you all. This just has been an amazing night tonight. I hope everyone has enjoyed this. But really, on behalf of Roberta Gosling, our board chair of Cornerstones, we really just want to share our appreciation for everybody coming out tonight. First, to our amazing moderator who, yes, went to Richmond lunch meeting, drove back today, Tracy White, to be here. Mark, Maria, and Pastor Stephen for bringing those really important questions to the forefront. And most of all, to our guests here tonight. I don't know about everyone else, but just so grateful to have learned so much more about what you all have already done and your clear ideas, vision, and passion for public service. So as Tracy said, that truly is the hardest work, and we thank you for agreeing to put yourselves forward for this role. An event like this doesn't happen without a lot of hard work, and just quickly, just want to acknowledge Rabbi Holtzman's amazing opening comments and this congregation, and so good to see Rabbi Bogue and others who were here and helped inspire when I first joined Cornerstones. But MBHC is a congregation that leads and acts for justice all year round, so we're so glad that they would host this event. Jerry Ferguson, the Fairfax Public Access, Peggy Fox is here, the board members. Jerry is one of best of Reston, so you know, because not only does he do this to bring information to people, but he really works with organizations like ours to help us tell our stories. And so we're so glad you were here. And of course, to the many team members from the Chamber of Commerce and Cornerstones who made this joint venture possible, Charles Kapoor and Carrie Pulliam, and of course the community change partners I work with every day, Tracy White, Roberta Gosling, Andy Latcher, Amanda Karin, who is our chief cattle hunter for policy, and Margaret Ann Laura, Sarah Casey, Meredith Hovan, and Aaron Bertholtz, who are here tonight. So I need to say thank you to them because this brings it together. It's so great to see so many of you here tonight, to think that we could be in a room together to do this. I will admit, as Rabbi Holtzman opened, we did get some head scratching about the Chamber and Cornerstones putting this thing on together, and I think that that really is because people don't know our community, and they don't know that this is community, where people of faith and business leaders, community residents, parents, all of us come together to work on issues that matter to all of us. And I think that has been the hallmark and the foundation for the Chamber and Cornerstones as we work together over these many years. We share a lot of focus on things that are foundational. We heard a lot of these ideas this morning. Housing justice. Housing is foundational. And it's important not just for a thriving economy, the workforce, for the families, and certainly for the success. But it's also important that we are here together when we think about housing for those who are not being served at a time in my career, professional career, where I've never seen so much vulnerability and the need for us to find ways to build that most foundation. It affects our kids, as we've heard, it affects our families, and it affects the thriving community that we all love and work in. So it's something that we've been doing for 50 years. That was noted, inspired by Bob Simon, Communities of Faith, founded Reston Interfaith, now Cornerstones, and we have since grown to bring these issues to the attention, to be a convener, and to continue to work with elected officials who just, I don't know what we'd do without you. We have heard very impressive ideas here. I want to start and say that, as we look at the new District 7, we have been so fortunate in Reston to be so well served for many years by two incredible leaders who are retiring, Janet Howell and Ken Plum, and we can applaud them. Center was part of the rah-rah that fought for a homeless shelter in Reston, and Ken Plum, just a historian and educator and a person who often shares that he got into politics as our longest serving member so that he could change the backward vision of what people saw for Virginia, and I know he has done that. And I think now it gives us the opportunity as we welcome the next generation of leaders for this community to see how they will build on that wonderful foundation and shape this community for the future. We have more than 28 lawmakers across the state. There are 140 members up for re-election, the entire House and Senate in Virginia, following a year of redistricting, and it's the year before a presidential election when nobody gets out to vote. So I'm pointing you to the back of the room and the efforts of the folks that are here to say to all of you and for the folks online with us, it's really important to vote. Get out in the primaries, get other people, help them out. These candidates deserve it, and it's a privilege that we have the right to exercise. So as we close tonight, before we move on to the wonderful desserts provided by Crumble and Nothing But Cakes, which I did a lot of during the pandemic, I would really just like to once again first thank our host this evening, Northern Virginia Hebrew Congregation, Joe Miller. We just want to present you all. They have done so much to host us, and we have thank you all, and without further ado, this is the time that you really now get to charge these candidates and ask all your burning questions. Again, thank you so much for joining the Chamber of Commerce, Cornerstones, and our faith community